Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. I'm Hui Bai. I'm a PhD candidate from University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. So this presentation is primarily based on a paper that I published in GPSP. And in this presentation, I will answer the following question. Do people with racist and sexist attitude actually support candidates that are white male, or do they support candidates that are conservative? As we know, a couple months ago, Kamala Harris was nominated as Joe Biden's pick for VP, and they win the election. Many news outlets have widely discussed her identity as a Black woman and whether she is undermined by citizens' racism and sexism because of her gender and race. And the question about whether the demographic background of a political candidate can play a role in support for that candidate is not entirely new. Many studies in the past investigated the effect of racism and sexism on support of prominent candidates such as Obama and Clinton. Many studies show that racism negatively predicts support for Obama, and the theory usually focuses on his race, that is, he's undermined by racism because he's Black. And similarly, opposition for Hillary Clinton was predicted by sexism, and the theory usually focuses on gender because a political leader is not being a political leader is not congruent with the traditional gender role for women. So sexism undermined Hillary Clinton because of her gender. And putting these together, the effect of racism and sexism on people's support for a particular candidate is determined by the candidate's race and gender, respectively. And this is what I will call the demographic hypothesis distilled from the past literature. But there are some issues with it. It cannot accommodate a growing number of observations. For example, the racism variable was negatively predictive of support for Hillary Clinton. And as we know, she's a white person. And sexism was found to be possibly related to support for Sarah Palin, and she's a female candidate. And to accommodate for these findings, researchers have to resort to less parsimonious explanations. For example, the effect of racism on Hillary Clinton was something that spilled over from the negative effect of racism on Barack Obama. And Sarah Palin was benefited from sexism because she conducted herself in a more womanly fashion than Hillary Clinton. And also, the demographic hypothesis is not as parsimonious because it is also have to rely on several moderators. So in order to understand the effect of X number of prejudice, in the case we had racism and prejudice, we will need an X number of moderators as well. So in this case, we need race and gender, 2 moderators here. But if we also want to know the effect of, say, Islamophobia, we also need to know the candidate's religious background. So as we have more type of prejudice in the model, we need to have more moderator in the model. An alternative, and what I think is a more parsimonious explanation, is the political ideology hypothesis I propose here. And according to this hypothesis, racism and sexism predict support for conservatives and opposition for liberals, regardless of the candidate's race and gender. So the candidate's ideology is the key moderator, and the as we can see here, and the theory is also more parsimonious because we only need 1 moderator in the model. So the primary purpose of the paper is to compare these two explanations. And theoretically, doing this is also important because it can clarify exactly how citizens' prejudice can translate into their personal political preferences. And furthermore, it can also help us understand exactly what type of societal consequences prejudice can lead to. So does prejudice among the citizens undermine political candidates that are racial minorities and women, and as a result, contribute to inequality of the opportunity faced by the individual candidates? Or alternatively, do prejudice undermine candidates whose policies can advance social progress and as a result contribute to the inequality in the society as a whole? And as we know, the number of racial minority and women are increasingly entering the political arena as well as the society. It will be particularly important to clarify this question. I conducted a collection of studies. I will only talk about the first 2 in a little more detail and the remaining ones in less details. Overall, the sample characteristics is described here. The sample is large, and some are more nationally representative than others. All of my analysis include all gender and all racial groups. So look at study 1A and 1B. So if we want to know if racism and sexism are related to candidate support based on their gender or race, it will be useful to see how they relate in the real world context. So the demographic hypothesis will be supported if racism is positively related to the white candidates and negatively related to the black candidates, and sexism positively related to the male candidates and negatively related to the female candidates. In contrast, ideology hypothesis will be supported if racism and sexism are negatively related to support for the liberal candidates and positively related to support for the conservative candidate, regardless of their race and gender. So in these two studies, I just measure racism and sexism in in several different ways using pre-existing data. And for the dependent variable, it's just a feeling thermometer for the political candidates. And these are the individual linear regressions, just using the prejudice measure to predict support for each of the candidates separately. I also did a mixed effect model, just combining all these together, and the results are the same. And together, we see that the effect of racism and sexism are negative for the liberal candidates, and they're mostly positive for the conservative candidates. So we did not see this. We did not see this. What we saw was something like this. So overall, there's not much support for the demographic hypothesis, assuming the past, but there is a lot of support for the ideology hypothesis that I'm proposing here. By the way, I also, for all of the studies, all of the models, I also did model comparisons, and the comparisons consistently favor the model that correspond to the current theory about ideology over the past theory about demographic background. Study 2 is an experiment, so participants evaluate a hypothetical candidate. The candidate's ideology, party, race, and gender are all manipulated independently, so it's a 2x2x2x2 design. They use a different way of measuring sexism. The DV is a scale of a feeling thermometer and a voting likelihood. This is how the candidate looks like. I also did a pilot study for this, and all of the 4 factors are successfully manipulated using this procedure. This is how I manipulate race, gender, ideology, and party identity. So again, this is a linear regression. I use the manipulated factor, each of the 4 manipulated factors, to interact with the prejudice measure. And we see in this green box, race, gender, or party, none of them is moderating the effect of prejudice. Instead, ideology appears to be the only meaningful moderator here, as shown in the red box. So again, the past demographic theory is now supported, and the current ideology theory is supported. Study 3 was using a national representative data from American National Election Study. It looked at the effect of racism and sexism on real candidates with a varying degree of perceived ideology historically. The effect of racism are on the left and sexism on the right, for presidential candidate on the top and House of candidates on the bottom. And we see that for the candidates perceived to be conservative, represented by the red bars, the effect of the prejudice are positive. And the reverse of that is for the candidates perceived to be liberal, so represented by these blue bars. And for the moderates, the effect is pretty much muted. And the same pattern is applied for candidates, regardless if it's the presidential candidates or House candidates, whether it's racism or sexism. Design for study 4 and 5 are similar to study 2. Study 4 just use a different way of measuring racism. It is a racism measure that look at people's intention to not to interact with the racial outgroup. Pattern is the same. And study 5 is focusing on the prejudice against Muslim and see how that relates to support for candidates that are Muslim versus Christian, and crossing with that, conservative or liberal. Study 6 is very similar to study 4, except I used the implicit racial bias. It's the IAT. and the pattern is the same. So just give you a quick overview. Study 4 look like this. Again, study 5 look like this. We see these interactions. Study 6, that's the one using implicit racial bias. This still has an interaction like that. All right, so yeah, so overall the findings are relatively robust. The results are similar regardless of which measure I use, and they still hold when I'm controlling for other confounds. The results are also robust to different political contexts. In particular, study 1B data was collected at a time when presidential candidates were still competing for nomination within their own party. So Carson and Fiorina, that's a one black candidate and one female candidate. When they were competing with white males in 2016 election against Jeb Bush and Donald Trump, these two candidates, Carson and Fiorina, they were still benefited from racism and sexism as we saw in study 1B. So the results are robust to that condition, that context. And also, the moderating effect is also unlikely to be something that's unique to the most recent decades or so when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were running for presidents. Analysis from study 3 for the House of Representative stuff, that's from before 2004. So that was before they started to run for presidential candidate as well. So as we saw earlier, the effect of ideology was still observed. Theoretically, this study clarified exactly what citizens' prejudice can lead to and how they can be translated into citizens' political preferences, as well as what type of candidates citizens' prejudice can be benefiting or undermining. And as I mentioned earlier, as a growing number of minority and female candidates are entering political arena and the diversity of the society is growing, and this research timely shows that it is the latter that is undermined more so by the former. In revising the case of Kamala Harris, although people who are racist and sexist definitely do not like her, what my research showed is that it would not be because of her race and gender. It will really be because of her liberal ideological standing. I have some qualifications and limitations in this research. For example, the studies look at the overall trend. So it's possible that some people are just unwilling to support a minority or a woman candidate. And also perceive the ideology of the candidates can confound the effect of a prejudice. As past studies show, people can infer the ideological standing of a candidate just based on their race and gender. So a black liberal can be perceived to be more liberal than a white liberal. So that can play a role as well. And finally, the study is primarily based on the US sample. So it's unclear whether the results generalize to other societies. And with that, I will conclude this presentation and express my gratitude toward all of the individuals and organizations that helped this. Let me know if you have any questions, and this is my email. Thank you very much for tuning in.